we're women. There's a lot of us. But the representation, the awards, the accolades, they're not coming for us.
Today we have our guest, Elaine Low. She is a reporter for The Ankler.
Being part of Hollywood is being part of a gig economy. You're facing really different challenges.
She covers the evolution of Hollywood, the business, the behind the scenes, the nitty gritty of it all. What we are wondering is what Hollywood kind of needs to do to raise these numbers.
Well, if you're going to have women that are nominated for Oscars for directing or writing or producing, you have to actually have women working in the industry first.
When you look at this year's Oscars, women of color only make up 3.9% of all nominees.
That number is astronomically low.
Welcome to Broadlines,
A weekly video podcast by the Female Quotient,
where real headlines meet real conversation.
I'm Natalie Lizarraga, a journalist and former news anchor.
And I'm Rae Williams, an entertainment, lifestyle, and culture journalist.
Today, we're going to be talking about the 2026 Oscars and how women are showing up in this year's race. All right, Rae, it is Oscar week here.
My favorite week.
I know that's your whole bag.
I will not actually be at the Oscars this year. I've gone the past 2 years. I will not be there this year because we will be at South by Southwest.
We will.
Interviewing one, like, oh my God.
Basically,
So
your Oscars.
It's my Oscars, so I don't need to be there.
Did you want to continue your tease about who you'd be interviewing? That is your Super Bowl?
It's Emma Grede.
There you go. So make sure you guys tune into that. We're going to talk today, though, about the evolution of women in the media, from the characters that they portray to the paychecks they are or are not getting.
We're looking at the nominations, and this year, Chloé Zhao is the sole female director nominated. So interestingly, among the top 100 movies at the domestic box office, only 9 Hollywood films had female directors at the helm. And this is a fascinating report actually issued by Stacey L. Smith of the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at the University of Southern California. And so she did this like in-depth study just about, just inclusion in the industry, diversity in the industry, what that's looking like. And that was just a shocking stat to me because I'm like, what do you mean out of 100, there's only 9 that were directed by women?
I mean, we were going over this and the stats here, and I don't I don't want to one-up you, but there's only one female cinematographer nominated, and that's for Sinners. And we got to look back at how we got here because there are a lot of stuff that we read and researched, and some of it is really shocking. We're women. There's a lot of us. We're doing a lot of these jobs, but the representation, the awards, the accolades, they're not coming to us.
And I remember a couple years ago, I actually interviewed Mandy Walker. So she was nominated for Best Cinematographer, just one of a few women that's ever been nominated. At the time, obviously, if she had won, she would have been the first woman to win. I mean, absolutely delightful lady. And, of course, I asked her about coming up in the industry as a woman. And she was like, yeah, there was nobody.
If you've seen Elvis, you're wondering,
how did she not win?
The only thing compelling about that movie was the colors and the lighting and all of that stuff. Certainly wasn't the story. Or the man who never changed his accent after he was Elvis. I don't want to know what her reaction was, but I'm sure, you're disappointed when you're the best of the best and still you didn't win. We see a lot of that, unfortunately.
When we look at something like this, I always have to think of intersectionality. And I always say that when something affects all women, it affects women of color probably at double the rate. And so when you look at this year's Oscars, women of color only make up 3.9% of all nominees. And I know I have seen some fantastic work from women of color all throughout. So that really surprised me and honestly was kind of fucked up.
That number is astronomically low.
I think for this year's Oscars, there are some historic firsts that could happen. And I think we still have to celebrate that because even though Chloé Zhao is the only one, that's no small feat. And for her to potentially be the first or even be in this category at this point, we do have to acknowledge that as, absolutely phenomenal for what it is. But the overall numbers still show this major imbalance in who gets recognized and even more so who gets to actually tell the stories. Women make up about a third of the Academy right now, according to their most recent diversity report. And I think if we want to start to remedy this, I think one of the places we can start is to look at the Academy, which is the voting body for the most prestigious award. And so right now, women make up 1/3 of the Academy Award, according to their most recent diversity report, so 34%. And it actually used to be worse.
I thought 34% was a lot.
Yeah, it used to be 25%.
I mean,
So,
that's sad, but I was like, wow.
yeah. And then they had a inclusion initiative in 2016, so about 10 years ago, and that's where the numbers have risen since then. And I know other academies too had similar problems, but I know like the
Mhm.
Recording Academy, for instance, has skyrocketed their numbers
Yeah.
of women in music. So I would love to see the same thing happen for film.
When we talk about representation in movies versus TV when it comes to women, and it seemed that there was more space for women when it came to streaming broadcast TV. What are some of your favorite shows that involve maybe the women that we're seeing now as more evolved characters, imperfect, not the TV of old?
I wouldn't necessarily say evolved when we talk about like an Emily in Paris. You know what I mean? I wouldn't say
This
she's
is literally my biggest guilty pleasure.
the post. I wouldn't say that evolved is necessarily the word, but I think just watchable, relatable to a certain degree. Some people can relate, some people can't, fine. But I think relatable to those of us who are interested in that type of show, and just kind of a call to the old days of like kind of like the, kind of Saved by the Bell-esque type of like, like real life situations, but just I guess more elevated.
Saved by the Bell on like the most ridiculous non-real life situations.
But so does Emily in Paris though. But like
Oh no, hers are absurd.
I know, but like when I say real life, I don't mean like
Your real life? You live an exciting life.
okay, the real like okay, the aspirational real like you know what I mean? Like the suspension of belief, the
Correct.
like I
So
don't know,
not
the
real
whimsy. So not okay,
situations.
not real life. Okay, and me in my head, I am in Paris with Emily, okay? The Gina Davis Institute also found that when women are directors or writers, female characters have more speaking time, obviously, greater agency, and are less likely to be sexualized, which tells us something about who needs to be in the seat a little
Mhm.
bit more. And they also found that exposure to women portrayed as leaders on screen correlates with increased perception of women as capable leaders in real life.
The other thing that we needed to talk about, of course, when it comes to women in Hollywood is how much we are getting paid or how much we're not getting paid for. We've seen a lot of women be more public about this,
Mm-hmm.
be more transparent about their paychecks, showing emails about what they're making in comparison to men or what they're asking for and not getting.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen women like Reese Witherspoon respond by taking matters into their own hands, making their own production companies,
Yeah.
female-led content. And it's a little disheartening sometimes to think that, like, well, all these studios wouldn't do it, so I had to go
Right.
do it myself. Um, I think you see that a lot more because there are other, like Shondaland and all of these
Mm-hmm.
other female-led production companies. We've had Jennifer Lawrence make it very public about addressing the pay disparities that she's seen. I think we've seen a lot of changes. Obviously, we always say this afterwards, not enough, but
Mm-hmm.
changes that are happening very publicly, which
Yeah.
I think behind closed doors, it was easier to hide that you didn't have to disclose your paycheck or the studio didn't pay you as much and they didn't have to tell anyone they weren't paying you as much or make that public.
Yeah.
Women are now negotiating together collectively, and that is a huge difference than maybe one woman fighting for herself. And as you always put, Rae, fighting for your life.
My life always. And I think the men have a role to play too. And I know I saw reports that Chadwick Boseman had, taken essentially a pay cut to make sure
Mhm.
that there was equality on his film. And so thank you to the 3 or 4 men that are doing that.
Yeah.
But I think that is also a role that needs to happen. But it should be from the studio side. I don't think,
Right.
I mean, the men shouldn't have to. I'm glad that they do. And if the more that they do it, I think more, people will see that things
Mhm.
need to be equal.
I also think that like it's visible, as you mentioned, to see women in power on screen in these powerful positions. It also gives the average viewer or the young girl out there confidence in the fact that she can kind of expand her sense of possibility. I think we got like a lot of that from movies is that you look to it to see maybe a life that you want to lead, and if you see representation, you're more able to feel like you can do that.
Exactly. Today we have our guest, Elaine Low. She is a reporter for The Ankler. She covers the evolution of Hollywood, the business, the behind the scenes, the nitty gritty of it all. And Hollywood is super expansive. If you're not familiar with the industry, it's not just a red carpet. She's won awards from the LA Press Club. She's a podcast host as well for The Ankler Agenda. And she's covered everything from global programming strategy to Mindy Kaling's growing comedy empire to Hollywood's reckoning over representation amid the Black Lives Matter movement. So wide subject matter here, and there's so much. So welcome, Elaine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us here.
Okay, so we are kind of talking about the 29% reality. So despite the high-profile success of Chloé Zhao, for instance, and Jessie Buckley, there are reports from women in film that show that women only receive 29% of total Oscar nominations. Of course, we're coming up to the Oscars, and that was in 2025. So what we are wondering is what Hollywood kind of needs to do to raise these numbers.
Well, if you're going to have women that are nominated for Oscars for directing or writing or producing, you have to actually have women working in the industry first. And so it's really about raising those numbers and giving women a platform across the industry. And those numbers have been a little bit volatile in recent years. It's not linear. Then again, progress rarely is linear. We're seeing, those numbers increase here and there. But really, sometimes when you look at it, it can feel a little bleak when you're trying to figure out how much progress is actually happening.
So in the time that you've been covering Hollywood, have you seen kind of shifts and not even just on the talent side, but just in the behavior of the behind the scenes that would indicate that exactly what you said is happening?
Well, behind the scenes, when you're looking at the corporate side of Hollywood and studios and production offices, DEI is a conversation that has really taken a back burner in recent years. It was something that was prominent in 2020 and then kind of just tailed off really disappointingly. And, the DEI programs, DEI initiatives at the major studios, really have gone on the back burner, it feels like. And that obviously has an impact on the number of women, the number of people of color we wind up seeing within, the corporate side of Hollywood as well as on screen.
And so in 2025, there was a USC Annenberg study that found that there was actually no difference in Metacritic scores between films directed by men and films directed by women, yet women were hired for fewer intellectual property franchises. Does this kind of prove or suggest anyways that Hollywood is hiring based on safety? Hollywood plays it safe a little bit. Do you see that as a reason why maybe there is this kind of imbalance?
Risk aversion is unfortunately the name of the game these days. When you're talking about creative in Hollywood, when you're talking about behind the scenes, what kind of TV shows, what kind of movies are developed, we're in a time when the economics are really tough. The industry is shrinking. The studios are shrinking. Right now, we're looking at a pending merger between Paramount Skydance, Warner Brothers Discovery, which means we're going from 5 major film studios to 4, essentially. And we just saw the merger of Disney and Fox, a little more than 5 years ago. So this is a space that's shrinking. And what happens when you have a development side and a creative side that's shrinking is, you're going to make more risk-averse decisions. And that's something that I hear when I talk to TV agents, when I talk to producers and writers, is that people aren't as willing to take big swings anymore when it comes to development. And so when you have more risk aversion, what winds up happening is you go back to the creators who are safe bets, who are reliable. And that winds up having an impact on diversity and the number of women, the number of people of color, the number of new voices that are taken a chance on. And I think the last time we really saw, new voices come into the conversation was around the era of peak TV. There were crazy overall deals and crazy deals for first-time showrunners. And the downstream effect of that was that new voices were really given a shot. And that meant fresh voices, young voices, people who normally wouldn't have been taken a chance on. And so when you're seeing this risk aversion, the downstream effect of that risk aversion is that when you're taking fewer shots on goal, that means you have fewer projects in development, you are hiring fewer people. And so you wind up going back to the showrunners or the creatives who you deem safe, the guys who were directing or writing shows back in the 90s disparities for you.
So I know you cover a lot of the business when it comes to Hollywood, and we talk about women that are at higher positions in this industry, one of them being Donna Langley there at NBC Universal, and some other women that are in pretty high seats. Do you think that we've seen the shift in the industry is going to coincide with an increase of women in these powerful positions? Because there's not a lot of them, but maybe we'll see more because there are a few.
One would hope that's the trajectory that the industry would take, right? But yeah, like you mentioned, we have a number of very high-powered women in the industry. There's Donna Langley over at Universal. There's Bella Bajaria over at Netflix, who is the content chief to a service that services more than 300 million subscribers. And, you have one of the co-heads of Warner Brothers Pictures, Pam Abdi. So you have folks in really high-powered positions, but at the same time, like you said, there aren't that many of them. There's progress, but we would love to see more. And I think when it comes to hiring, there's that old notion, right, of people sort of hire the people who remind them of them. And so hopefully when the door has been cracked open more, we'll see a little more diversity in the mix.
Do you think there is room for kind of, I guess, independent, even directors, filmmakers, that kind of thing, to get into executive and leadership positions in this kind of atmosphere that we're in, especially, given that there are not a lot of seats at the table, but there is this kind of boom of independent content and celebrations of, independent filmmakers. And I think of somebody, for instance, like Zinzi Kugler, who, is Ryan Coogler's partner, and they operate as a couple. But even for someone like that to kind of work her way in, if she wanted to something, to take over these corporate entities, do you see room for that with women?
That's actually probably what I hear most, that you have to be entrepreneurial right now. You have to be entrepreneurial. You have to have that kind of indie spirit in order to get ahead, because honestly, the ladder is broken. When we talk about the corporate ladder, when we talk about how do we get to those positions of power, promotions are scarce. The middle winds up getting squeezed, especially in corporate Hollywood, when there are thousands of layoffs happening around people. And the thing that I hear most from people who wind up getting laid off is, oh, it's women, it's people of color. Those are a number of people who are getting squeezed out of those positions. And so, when you're trying to climb the ranks, that, really poses a difficulty there. Traditionally, if you started out in Hollywood sold a relatively stable fantasy of how a career worked, right? Actors started out in commercials. Everybody else started out as an assistant or in the mailroom, and you worked your way up. But really, these days, being part of Hollywood is being part of a gig economy. And the studio system is so troubled. Streaming has reshaped how the economics work. And so now, if you're somebody who's trying to climb the ranks, you're facing really different challenges. There's not sort of a traditional path to take.
I think, too, if we dive deeper into the changing, AI is a huge one that people are afraid of. It seems simple enough, but it loses creativity when it's not by a person, when someone's not really writing it. What do you think, if you could just kind of navigate that for us, what the threat is for AI for a lot of creatives and people in the industry, and where do you think it's going?
Okay, so this one's interesting because covering the strikes 3 years ago, the writer strike, the actor strike, AI was a huge issue, right?
Yeah.
It was on all the picket signs. People were just straight no on AI. But over the last 3 years, we've seen so much advancement in this technology. People are deploying it on set. They're using it in pre-production for pre-visualization. They're using it in post-production to help them edit faster. There are scenarios where people are finding it useful, but there's a balance there. You don't want it to replace core human creativity. You don't want it writing scripts. You don't want it replacing actors on screen. Tilly Norwood, the synthetic AI performer, is an interesting case study in that, right? Of like, oh, here's this AI generated young woman, and agents are going to the idea is that they'll be able to have her work. I don't know what that means, right?
I think she had an agent and everything, and she was being marketed as
too weird,
an actress, and being kind of shopped around as this actress. And of course, the industry came out and was like, this is not going to fly.
When I give a human woman a chance.
Right, exactly. But it's interesting that they started that. To me, it's interesting anyways that they started that with a female performer, with a woman performer, because it's like, why didn't you make a Tom Cruise clone? Why didn't you make
Yeah.
Tilly Norwood? And so it kind of made me wonder if that's, the first line when it comes to that kind of, obviously we see the scenarios where AI is helpful, but that first line of like AI performers, if it is kind of coming for women first, if you will.
I mean, that's a sticky subject because I think you see more people very quietly using AI and in some instances not so quietly using AI in their creative work. And the question is always, where's the line and what's our own comfort level that we want to negotiate around it?
Where do you draw the line on AI?
As a journalist, pretty hard line.
Yeah.
The most AI I think I use is really in just transcription services. When I record a lot of my interviews and, I get the transcription, but then I always go back through it and I'm listening to it and then cleaning it up. So it's really just sort of like a first draft of the transcript.
Right.
But that's literally all I use it for. Like, I've actually never used ChatGPT.
Wow. I was a long holdout.
Yeah.
And then I folded because I saw all the cool other stuff it could do. I think that, like, if I'm using AI also as a journalist, I use like a starting prompt to get my mind going, and then I shut it down and then go, because one, I can't trust it. Especially when it comes to facts, but it can kind of get creative juices flowing for me, like a starting point to then go from there. But it's hard sometimes, I will admit, to not just be like, we'll just let it write the thing because it's right here and I'd like to go do something else. But it's a temptation that I think is really hard because it's just so darn easy.
I was just talking about this with a friend. I just got fooled by an AI singer that I thought was fantastic and did not realize it was AI until, the conversation started. And, I think it's one, I think there needs to be, for me, a very clear indication that it is AI so that I know where I can put the borderline for my emotions. And I think that's why Tilly Norwood, for instance, gives us pause, because it's like, even if we start to like her and to be a fan of her and we accept her,
what does that mean?
What does that mean, right? And are we connecting to real performers? And I think that is a threat for the industry in a way.
And there's also the risk, right, of being left behind if you're not going to adapt to that new technology. Think of anybody who didn't want to use email in the 90s, or didn't want to really use the full force of the internet, and where that would get you professionally now, if you could imagine doing that.
There was a study that said that we are in a 7-year low, so that in 2025, women directed about 8% of the top 100 grossing films, a significant drop from 13% in 2024. And I think the question that we have, and we can't kind of talk about women in Hollywood or Hollywood and women without kind of talking about Barbie. Fight me. I don't care. It was my personality for a whole year. But we kind of saw that this was like, we had this Barbie effect after Barbie where, there was a surge of, women embracing the industry, women feeling powerful within the industry on screen and off screen. But with this kind of dip, does that suggest that that was a temporary peak rather than a structural shift in how studios kind of give budgets to women?
Barbie, obviously directed by the great Greta Gerwig. At the same time, it's based on IP, right? And IP has ruled Hollywood for I don't even know how many years now, because that goes back to sort of the risk aversion. And Barbie was such an interesting mix of that because it was based on known IP, based on, a doll that's been around for how many decades, but at the same time took so many fun, creative risks. But when you have a environment that is driven by IP, driven by sequels, driven by franchises, we're going back to the idea of risk aversion. And when you're going back to the idea of big tentpole films like Barbie, like action movies, the directors of action movies and superhero movies tend to be men. Unless you're thinking about Patty Jenkins and Wonder Woman. You can probably count on one hand the number of women who have directed big tentpole films like that. And so there's also the interplay of risk aversion in terms of the underlying content and the underlying source material there.
Of course, we were talking kind of behind the scenes about Bridgerton. What are we watching? For me, it's Bridgerton, Emily in Paris, yes, I haven't gotten to the latest season yet. I'm kind of bouncing back between both. But what is your opinion on the kind of primary drivers behind this rise in women-led companies? So we have, Shondaland, we have Lucky Chap, Kaling International, which I love everything Mindy Kaling makes in the weirdest way. And then Hello Sunshine, of course, which is Reese Witherspoon. So do you think that that's a trend that we can lean into?
When you have people who are big stars, there is the drive to create your own production company, no matter who you are, because as an actor, as a writer, that gives you a lot more creative control. It allows you to get behind the scenes in development, to really platform voices that might not have traditionally been platformed. And so that's the benefit to having huge stars like Shonda Rhimes and Reese Witherspoon and Mindy Kaling have their own production companies, because then you get to see great shows like Bridgerton, which has such a different take. I actually haven't read the books, but my understanding is, that the shows are a lot more diverse than the books are. I think. Or when you have Mindy Kaling, right, like The Sex Lives of College Girls, just really great shows like that get to platform a bunch of different voices without being like, hey, we're women,
Right. Or like, hey, we're like,
girl
like,
power.
you don't notice, I think, and I hesitate to say you don't notice the diversity, because you do, but the diversity of women in those particular programs, I think, are really so well
Organic.
done that, organic is the word, perfect, that you don't say, oh, well, they've got like one black girl, one white girl, one this, one that. You don't even notice that, because you're just kind of so enthralled in the storytelling and the complexity of the characters. And I personally think that's something that's uniquely accomplished by women.
And then that hopefully perpetuates a positive cycle, right? Of girls who grow up seeing it on screen and not really thinking about it in an active way, the way maybe we thought about it growing up, of having to be like girl power, to really platform it in that way, in a way that becomes more organic. And I don't want to say effortless, because, everything always does require effort and does require some level of advocacy, but in a way that is much more authentic.
I think we're seeing a lot more real characters than we've ever seen before,
Yeah.
that we can actually relate to. I feel like growing up watching TV, you kind of idolize these women for their perfection, and like you kind of had a skewed view
They're
of,
having it
like,
all.
Yeah.
what you wanted or thought it was about. And now you're seeing people that are like you, that are
Mhm.
having struggles, emotional moments, things that you've had that become more real. I do want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about pay disparity, because
Mm.
we've seen so many headlines now more recently, women being more open about what they're getting paid or what they're not getting paid, more importantly. And a lot of those conversations used to happen behind closed doors, but now people are more public about that and trying to get equal pay when it comes to women versus men. Do you think that they're getting that because now it's public, and maybe they were resistant before? Is it public pressure that's putting it on them, or they're realizing, hey, you're doing the same job, you should get paid the same amount of money? Like, is it real?
I think there's more transparency among younger women, younger people in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, for all of the criticism that Gen Zs get, the one thing I love that this generation is doing is engaging in wage transparency,
Yeah.
in actually sharing how much they make with other people, instead of it being sort of like I'm going to talk to my close girlfriends about this and try to sort of feel it out.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the young people I've talked to, sorry, it makes me sound like such an elder millennial, but I'm like, the young people I talk to,
Yep.
the like 25-year-olds, right, who are like
Yeah.
starting out, who are like on assistant desks. They're like, yeah, like I'll talk about it openly, and I'll ask them about it, and I'll say, can I publish this in the story? And they're like, yeah, if it helps somebody else. I'll tell you that when I was a showrunner's assistant, I made $40,000 a year. And, and somebody else told me that when she was an assistant, she was making 40 something grand a year. And the only way that she was able to advocate for a higher salary for herself was by being transparent about that with her coworkers, and discovering that she wasn't being paid as much as other people who worked in the exact same position.
Yeah.
And it's really only with that kind of openness that we can achieve, pay equity.
Oh my gosh. I remember my assistant paycheck. And I remember my boss being like, just so you know, they're not going to pay you as much as you deserve. So I'm going to have to supplement your pay.
Out of their pocket?
Yeah.
Whoa.
And so my boss would give me an additional paycheck, because I think it was like $300 a week or something. But I will say he's he's like my TV dad, but along with that came being his personal assistant. So the money was like, you're going to work for it, but you're also going to get your benefits and everything from this larger production company. But I just remember the empathy it was like, I know you're not making enough to live. So we have to come in and supplement your pay. But it's crazy to me that these places that make all this money, even when they're struggling, they're making so much money. But for the people that work there, they're not willing to cut the check. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
And your experience also speaks to the mentorship aspect of it, right? And having somebody to really fiercely advocate for you, to champion you.
Yeah.
And I don't know that young women or young people in general in Hollywood are getting that right now, just because everybody's so worried about their own jobs.
Right.
Yeah. I was going to say to you, there's always this conversation. I think there's this idea that, oh, no, there's enough seats at the table. There's, spaces for all of us. And I kind of wonder specifically for Hollywood, for women in Hollywood, if that's actually true, if there are enough seats for everybody to go around and how we kind of overcome that.
Like you said, entrepreneurial, you have to put your own chair at the table and say, there's plenty of space, move over.
I was talking to a 22-year-old young woman recently for this feature story that I was writing on Gen Zs in Hollywood. And she was telling me, what I really want is this concept of sponsorship, which is a very business school term, which is like a next level mentorship, right? Where it's this person is not just giving you guidance over a cup of coffee once a quarter. There's somebody who's actively saying, this person has a lot of potential. I'm going to help open the door for her. I'm going to help get her this job. And that's not really the kind of fierce mentorship I think we see much anymore in any industry.
Which is leading to part of the problem.
Maybe we need more of that when it comes to women.
When we talk about sort of the emotional labor that women take on, both at home and in the workplace, I think there's also an element of this is something else that women have to grapple with. And a lot of women do it enthusiastically, but it's also just one more thing. And wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to do that?
I think you're right. Our plates are full because there are so few women, and then you take on all the responsibilities because there's so few women and that you can only do it a certain way as a woman. Your plate is full of things already in your job. And then being a mom, being a girlfriend, being a wife, being a friend, everything is just, it's a lot.
Shouldn't the onus also be on men to help open the door for young women, for younger people coming up in the industry? The onus shouldn't just be on the women who have already, struggled so hard to get there. It really should be just on older generations in general to be able to advocate for those young folks, to be able to advocate for young women and say, yeah, you have potential and you deserve a seat at the table.
Let's talk about one thing that always grinds my gears. Actresses experience a huge drop in representation when they turn 40. And as a fellow 40, I think that's very unfair. One, I never thought I'd get here because I feel like you see yourself on TV in your 20s, and if you're 40, you're always 20. So you're like, oh, it doesn't matter. Then you start seeing the numbers of female characters in their 30s. That makes up about 35% of roles, which is still low when we're talking about numbers here. But it falls to just 16% for actresses in their 40s. Now, I know a lot of later millennials we are in our 40s, and we grew up seeing ourselves as teenagers and everything on TV, and now to see that drop be so dramatic is stark to me. In contrast, we see male characters, they actually are they go up, they get hotter somehow. As that changes, their numbers are climbing. What do you think it's going to take for us to counter that phenomenon?
Oh, that's a mouthful. If you have more women casting directors, if you have more women who are creative executives, more women who are behind the scenes, making these shows, making these movies happen. And also, I think, people who don't necessarily have that ageism bias sort of in the back of their minds as they're making these creative decisions.
I remember last year, actually, at the Oscars, kind of, comparing, we had Demi Moore, who was kind of on this press run, and a lot of the questioning that she got was about the fact that she kind of had this renaissance and was able to come back in front of the camera, as, a more mature, I want to say older, but as a more mature woman and play this role. And then there was also kind of juxtaposition of the fact that the other front runner was a 20-something-year-old, was Mikey Madison for Honora. So there was kind of this like back and forth, and there was even a conversation I remember in the like just kind of in the atmosphere about, you know, which one was going to win and would Demi win because she was older. And I think throughout award season, it went back and forth, you know, like I think she got the Golden Globe. Don't quote me on that, but she might have gotten the Golden Globe, but not the Oscar. And I think this conversation has kind of continued through Hollywood. Is there, from what you've seen, this kind of competition, I guess, between the 20-somethings and maybe for you, Natalie, too, just even like, you know, coming up in the industry, even on the news side, you know, this kind of competition between, okay, you're 40, 50, 60 and the kind of youngsters in the industry.
Like, aren't we past the point of pitting women against women, though?
Yeah.
Like, in media
I would hope.
headlines, in these kinds of conversations, doesn't that just feel so supremely outdated?
Yeah.
That's what I hope. But I think there's this, you know, there's this, I don't know, still lingering thing. And I'm wondering where that's coming from and if that is a hindrance to the progress of women, you know, in the industry. I will say for the news side, I think we see a lot of women anchors that are older,
Mhm.
and they're, you know, kind of, you know, they've been on there for, you know, 20, 30 years. And
Yeah.
that's, you know, like when they go away, it's a big deal. But
When it comes to just like the news side, I always liked seeing young reporters come in, and you just you have to encourage, I like you said, the mentorship. You have to encourage younger people to also feel comfortable around some of that veteran space. And I feel like when you isolate them to be like, you're young, you're green, that doesn't help anybody. And so, like you said, it is kind of trite to just pin women against women for age. But I also think that you're not as the stats show, you're not seeing the relatable 40-year-old. You're not seeing those things. So like, maybe I'm a unicorn to a 25-year-old who's in the news industry. Like, you're just not seeing it as relatable. So I think that's where the problem arises, that they're not seeing us and we're not
in the
seeing
content.
ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I had interviewed this woman a couple years ago. Her name is Felicia Pride, and she actually has a company called Honey Child. And it was all about women, and particularly women of color, in their like their honeys in their 40s and 50s. And it was, I think, I recall the first time I was seeing that particular kind of content. Because every time we talk about this, we have to talk about the fact that if women are experiencing something, women of color are probably experiencing it at double the rate. And that's not a factual statistic, but like, you know, that usually is the case, that there is an increase of whatever is happening for women. So that's the first time I saw that kind of content. So I think that's just an interesting just thing to even look at.
Is it because the stories of women in their 40s, like the bottom line is they're not going to make money? Are people not going to watch that story because it's about this particular part of the population?
I think there's more room than ever for those kinds of stories. And I think there is a receptiveness to it. And I think about all the different kinds of films that have really caught the public attention over the last couple of years. I think about, Amy Adams and Night Bitch, or I think, Rose Byrne's If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, of just stories of interesting, flawed, not picture perfect women. And even going as far back as, everybody's favorite soap, like Grey's Anatomy, right? Like, I think we've seen an evolution of time in embracing more flawed women. I wonder if it's just mainly a matter of volume and being able to get more of those kinds of characters on screen.
Do you think it might be due to like the male actors, like, for instance, like Brad Pitt getting more asses in theater seats than the female actresses? I mean, obviously there's a lot of bias that ties into that as women age and the kind of perception we have of that. But there's a statistic that actually says that women make up 49% of major characters in streaming, but they only make up 36% of main characters in major motion pictures. So there's even a difference there. So, I mean, do you have any ideas about what the disparity might be?
I think that goes back to the risk aversion question. of we're just in such a creatively risk-averse time. So, yeah, like, let's dust off Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise and get them back out there. And I love them.
Yeah, I love that. Defrost Tom Cruise is right.
I am a huge Mission Impossible fan. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But when you're a studio chief looking for a hit and you're, maybe your studio isn't in the best situation economically, you're going to go back to the well. You're going to go back to the things that work.
I think there's, always these recognizable names that you can call to that will get people to the theaters. At least that's what execs think. And it's, a certain amount of men and not so much the woman. You know what I mean? I don't hear as many of those conversations with okay, it's Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, XYZ. I mean, I think of them like I'll go see anything Angela Bassett is in. I'll go, see anything that, certain women are in, but you don't think of those people as like the blockbuster bringers. And I wish we could change that culture a little bit from within. And I think not to bring up Barbie again, but I think one of the things I had hoped is that, like, for instance, with Margot Robbie, that she kind of became this iconic, and I mean, she probably is for some people, but became this iconic, like, anything Margot Robbie is in, I'll go see it because she is a superstar. And I know, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, the studio system kind of used to be that you were working for one studio for like your entire career. And as a woman, especially, you became this iconic name for this studio. You know what I mean? And we just kind of don't have that anymore. And I feel like, not to say we should go back to a studio system where you're tied to one, but I think that is kind of a contributor to the reduction of, these women like star power names. But do you think that's true? Or am I
don't know about that. I think you have to go pretty far back when you're talking about a dame with a 6-picture deal,
Yeah.
So
I love that dame with a 6-picture deal.
First of all, I love that. I need it on a shirt.
I would like to be a dame with a 6-picture deal.
Yeah.
I love that.
I actually want to go back to the idea of women over 40 in these big roles. I wonder how much the beauty component of that plays into it. When you mentioned Demi Moore, I mean, that was a movie that had a lot to do with physical image, the substance, and how we view women over a certain age.
Yeah.
And, I think the common compliment is like, oh, like, you don't look your age, and like 40 is the new 30. And I and a lot of other folks are using all these serums and whatever, right? Like, and so I wonder if, like, I don't know. Like, I'm curious about what you guys think about that part of the conversation of, like, people who are 40 now don't really look like what we thought of as 40 when we were kids growing up.
Yeah.
But how much of that is also potentially damaging?
Yes, I think there is a movement right now about aging gracefully that maybe 5-10 years ago, when everyone was plumping their lips, getting Botox and doing all that stuff, it's kind of a step back now to let's age gracefully. But if you do that, and I've heard that the roles get less and less because now you're just someone's mom, or you're not playing anything larger than those niche roles.
How many actors let themselves go gray?
Yeah, not a lot. If we're being honest, it's true. There's still just a stigma of like, you're not pretty enough, or this is not going to sell because you're not the same 20-year-old that you used to be, unless the story is about you getting old or having I think a lot of it's like having postpartum struggles or having some sort of struggle. You can't just be a 45-year-old having a great life.
I think it's really going to take, like you said, that entrepreneurial spirit and like independent, filmmakers to come up and pitch their stuff, and women to kind of step forward. As much as we don't want to have to be the burden, and we would love the men to open the door, I think it might have to come down to us. With all of this, we have the Oscars coming up this weekend. I'll personally be watching that Best Actress race. There's a number of competitive women in there. We talked a little bit about how, maybe there were some that were snubbed, but we're going to look and see what these women can do to elevate the industry. I already have a winner picked out in mind, but I'm not going to say it in case I'm loud and wrong. But Elaine, we want to thank you so much for joining us today to talk about just all of the things that, affect women in the industry in front of and behind the scenes, and what we can do to kind of make that change.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was a great conversation. I think we got a lot of insight on where we stand as women. I will repeat myself. I hate to do that, but closing the gap is super important. But we do have a lot of good positives, a lot of good takeaways from what is happening. One of the things that I think the data increasingly shows, and kind of proven here, is when women win on screen, they also win off screen too. We're seeing more jobs, more opportunities, and the industry becomes more profitable not less.
Yeah. And I think for me, the takeaway is that representation actually does matter. Seeing women on screen encourages more women to be on screen. Seeing women on screen also encourages women off screen to be things they didn't imagine that they could be. And all the stats also point to that. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind as we decide who gets to tell the stories and what kind of stories we're telling.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on This Week for Broadlines. I'm Natalie Lizaraga.
And I'm Rae Williams. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.